Okay, well, sorry for the kind of late stream. Had a lot of stuff going on today. Something I forgot to mention in my CleriCon wrap up was I bought some stuff. There's a particular vendor who I think is really just a consignment for a bunch of folks selling used games and books and etc. And I bought some stuff last year, and I bought some stuff this year. What I like this hill giant miniature for Battle Lore. I actually own Battle Lore, and I thought it would be fun. I actually was wondering if I was going to use this. I was actually, I think I was going to try to use this for the adventure. If they got to the hex crawl, hey Ian, if they got to the hex crawl in the adventure, there's a giant, not a hill giant exactly, but I thought I could use that to show it off. I also got these Lord of the Rings. I don't know what they're made of, pewter or something. They're from Lord of the Rings miniatures. They're from the strategy battle game, which I'm not really. I don't really know much about, but I'm all for kind of cool. I'm a Lord of the Rings guy. Sorry about the glare. Let's see. There we go. And I thought they'd be fun. And I got what, like one Gandalf set, one Dark Marshal set, whatever that is, and then some, what are these, ring wraiths? Yeah, some ring wraiths. So I don't know if I'll get around to painting them, but I thought they would just be kind of cool. But the pièce de résistance, if you will, of this was I found this in the pile of magazines and materials that were for sale. It's Wargaming, the magazine of fantasy and historical simulation. And funny enough, this name kind of makes it hard to find information on this because you just put in Wargaming magazine and you get the phone book. I'm still kind of looking for stuff. It does seem to be related to, I'm not sure, actually, to the Wargamers Association. I'm not sure. But in here, Ian says, oh, sorry, let me see. Ian says, it looks like a decent giant size, maybe a little short, not so huge on these much oversized giant minis that are 4+ inches tall. Yeah, for me, it's just about the look of it, right? Because I wasn't playing with minis, so this not being to scale, for whatever you mean for scale, doesn't really matter to me. It was just going to be there to show, like, ba-bum, here's a special guy kind of thing. So for my purposes, it would have worked fine. But we didn't end up getting that far, so I didn't have to worry about that. Inside, let me switch cameras here so I can, hopefully this will work. Inside here is some articles. Wait, am I upside down? I think I am. Let me see if I can rotate this around. I know there is a way to rotate. No, that's not it. That is it. Hold on a minute. I have this kind of document scanner. So I don't really like to use it that much, even though it's set up here at my desk. It's hard for me to get everything in focus, and then it's a little bit funky. And then let me see, is this the thing that'll? No. Well, let's see. See, here it is. Can't remember what the buttons do. Okay, there we go. Okay. Inside of this, oh no, let's try that again. I'm gonna come back. Maybe this will work. Inside of this, there's a bunch of articles. One up here, there on the side, so we have something like just a Wargamers Association, I guess, update, what's in a name, which is actually pretty fun. I think it has some stuff on Egyptian hieroglyphics. Yeah, the gloss is killing me. But this one, number 3, Crunchy Frog, Populating a Medieval Fantasy by Arnold Hendrick, is what originally caught my attention. So I thought I would share because and here's that article on the hieroglyphics. It's fun. It's nothing that you couldn't find in any number of sources, but just have a little article on it. I couldn't figure out what year this came out. It's kind of hard to say. There are actually a couple of articles in here by Dave Arneson. One is funny. I'll probably read that maybe another time about him. It must be some response of his to stuff going on with D&D because that's just how it reads. But I'll read that at some point. Heck, maybe today. But we'll start with Populating Medieval Fantasy. So we get through what's a name, Battle of the Standard, and that's kind of fun, right? So I'm not the wargaming part. I'm not as huge. I mean, I'm interested in it, but I'm not knowledgeable. So here we go. So this particular article, I don't know. Like I said, I couldn't find a date on the magazine that I could find that was easy to find. But this article, anyway, from 1979 by Arnold Arnold Hendrick. What's funny about this, these are things that I've been grappling with as I've been trying to codify some hex crawl rules, basically to share, to do stuff with. And you tend to forget that people have been grappling with these questions in different ways for a long time. And it's easy to forget that, hey, wait a minute, people have been playing these games, doing this stuff for, especially if you include the wargaming element, for a very, very long time. And as usual, new generations come and are grappling with the same questions that older folks, the generations before, had already found ages ago. It seems to be the case with a lot of this. And let me just take a swig here of Hal's grapefruit seltzer water. Oh, is it grapefruit? I don't like grapefruit, but I actually like this seltzer. Okay. Populating medieval fantasy. Populating a medieval fantasy. Construction of a fantasy realm, either for traditional wargaming or fantasy games, requires some thought and figuring. Campaign game authors are all too prone to randomly placing towns, manors, and castles according to taste. And this is something as an aside, and I'm probably making a lot of asides here. On an aside, this has definitely been a frustration I've had, not just in terms of materials, but also just with generators as a whole, because and I've tried to avoid doing this with my personal thing because, one, I want to do something a little bit different, and two, I want to try to bring in something, quote unquote real, but something that makes a little bit of sense, right? When you're randomly generating hexes and you're just kind of getting towns, cities, villages kind of willy-nilly, depending on how you intend to use the space, it can come off feeling a little bit weird if you dig into it, because what's this big city doing out in the middle of nowhere? What is this town doing, right? So I definitely feel what this person's going through. Of course, he's going through it in 1979, and we're in 2024. That the farmland shown is grossly insufficient for the population, or grossly in excess of the population's need, plus the profit it gains from the land, is something most ignore. Then there's the problem of farmland to non-agricultural land, which leads to the whole issue of population density, or more simply, how close together the towns, manors, and castles should be to reflect a historical period. The computations and figures given here will illustrate the calculations involved for medieval France in the 1200s, in terms familiar to chivalry and sorcery gamers, who are probably more inclined to create a complex and hopefully realistic fantasy world than any other type of gamer. And as I will note later on, there is definitely a lot of detail in chivalry and sorcery about this stuff, which I haven't really had a chance to dig into, but I'm certainly now enthusiastic to give a look. Therefore, the data is designed to reflect high medieval France about 1200 AD. A short note is appropriate regarding medieval history with regard to France. The classic medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1400 AD, was not a period of decay, but one of regeneration. Europe had sunk to horrible depths in the Dark Ages, 500 to 1000 AD, in terms of population density, technical skills, mortality rate, natural and quote-unquote artificial, political structure, and just plain personal security. The medieval period was the time when national and international trade revived under increasingly large and more secure political units, coinage appeared again, farming skills improved drastically, population grew until the plagues of the late 1300s, and the foundations were laid for national states as the kings of Western Europe very gradually increased their power at the expense of the nobility. While wargamers are inclined to lump anything between the fall of Rome and the use of gunpowder weapons as medieval, and therefore somewhat barbaric, historians have a very different view of the matter. If you walked into historical 1200 AD France, you would find yourself in a world full of optimism, where things were getting better and better, where people were pleased with their progress to date and expected more in the future. Crass personal ambition was still present, but became more subtle after 1100 AD due to the downfall of virtually all of the great quote-unquote nasties in the 1000s AD, such as the folks of Anjou and a variety of Norman adventures. And I apologize for the horns that are blearing out, that are coming to my window. Hey, Matt, good evening from the UK. Well, good afternoon from the USA. Land area and population density. So they're using modern France, they're using medieval France as around the year 1200, which is kind of a nice, D&D and sort of medieval fantasy kind of varies, right? Or uses a hodgepodge of, I think, similar to this, to the author suggesting that folks just kind of lump everything together. Medieval, I think that happens in D&D too, where we see stuff all over the map going, including gunpowder to a certain degree, depending, all the way down, and mixed up with what we call maybe, or what the author would call the more formally kind of dark ages, eras of Europe. Land area and population density. Modern France has an area of 212,766 square miles and currently has over 45 million people. Remember, 1979. The estimated population of France in 1200 AD is 12 million people, or 56 persons per square mile. That is 11.4 acres per person, 640 acres to the square mile. So there's going to be a lot of the square mile and acre and kind of calculations, but I think once we see how it sort of lays out, we'll be able to, because I don't want to deal in square miles myself. I'm not trying to convert to square miles or square kilometers or anything like that. I kind of enjoy hexes, and it's funny because there's something about hexes in here. But once you start getting the numbers, we can see how we might be able to take these numbers and kind of use that square mileage to kind of use hexes or adapt them to hexes of that we like, using the square mileage of our hexes as a guide for kind of how it fits with their square miles. However, it is wiser to deal with medieval population by households or family units. Demographically, a household assumes one breadwinning male plus the family he supports. Families with sons capable of a man's work balance against the aged and infirm, so that a typical peasant family with 3 generations under the same roof might actually be considered 2 or 3 households. For this period, the author prefers an arbitrary 5 persons per household, which fits perfectly into chivalry and sorcery, where 20% of the population can bear arms, do a man's work in war. Many demographers use 4 persons per household, but often for more recent periods, and in any event, they are rarely happy with the results and fill their findings with caveats. This yields a population density of 11 households per square mile, or 58.2 acres per household for France in 1200 AD. Diet in the Middle Ages was cereal-based, supplemented by vegetables, occasional fish, fowl, or meat. This is healthy, if less than perfect, as modern Asia continues to prove. As such, a person can be assumed to require about 500 pounds of food per year, or 2,500 pounds for a household. The yield of farmland is expressed as a ratio of hundreds of pounds per acre. Good land in France in 1200 AD might yield 5-to-1 or 500 pounds per acre per year. This is a great improvement over the Dark Ages, where the yield was 2-to-1 to 3-to-1. Naturally, the type of crop and especially the weather could influence yield. In bad years, the ratio might drop to 2.5-to-1 to 4-to-1, and in good years climb as high as 7-to-1 or 8-to-1. Local prices for foodstuffs is a good measure of their yield. Let me see if I can slide this over. Of their yield in relation to each other. The higher the yield, the lower the price. Supply and demand laws worked very well in the medieval world. Now, this is getting a lot of kind of minutia, which is not usually my jam, but it's gonna be worth it, I would say, when we finally get to kind of a table where he'll round all this off into some tables. That will be kind of interesting. However, it is extremely unwise to sow and reap the same field every year, as within 5 or 10 years the land will be exhausted, and even after the first, a significant loss in yield can be seen. In the Dark Ages, a 2-field system was used, whereby a field was sown every other year. Except in special situations, this is also deleterious to the land, and by the High Middle Ages, a 3-field system was used, where a field was only sown for harvest once every 3 years, sometimes with a very secondary and sparse crop used in one of the 2 off years. Therefore, a man required 3 acres of land for every acre actually producing food. So what he's getting at is he's all this calculations that he's doing and running us through is going to get us towards, he's going to crunch all the numbers in a couple minutes. But this stuff is also useful to think about, right? How much, just for painting the scenes when you're looking at farmland and agriculture, if you're in a kind of medieval sort of fantastic thing, kind of what one needs to survive and thrive. It is also worthwhile to mention that the land production figures assume good, rich, full land. The use of horses with shoulder collars pulling iron-bladed plows, and the horses themselves having iron shoes for greater traction. In the Dark Ages, wooden plows were common, and oxes in simple harness, rather than shoulder harness, were the common beast, if not the farmer himself without animal aid. Finding good land wasn't too difficult, since until the 1300s, a great deal of European land was forested, and one need only clear the forest to get a good farm. In fact, the Middle Ages was mainly a period in which the expanding population did clear away the forest which had grown up, and return much of Europe's available land to the plow. Returning to computations of averages, using a 3-field system with 5-to-1 yield, a household would need 15 acres to fulfill its needs. However, given the political structure, in return for security, virtually all farmers had to pay taxes to the political system in money or kind to their lords. In chivalry and sorcery, This is 90 copper pieces a month, give or take 5 copper pieces a month, which can be assumed to be the money value of the excess food produced. Since 1 copper piece equals 1 pound of cereals, and I guess this is from Chivalry and Sorcery, but it's kind of a neat idea that 1 copper is 1 pound of cereals, which I would definitely use. On the average 50 copper pieces a bushel, this means a household is producing about an extra 1,100 pounds a year for a total production of 3,600 pounds per year. This would require 21.6 acres per household of farmland. This leads to the conclusion that a square mile of farmland with 1/3 of it under production at any one time would have 29.6 households working it, or 148 people. This contrasts the overall average of 56 per square mile. Naturally, there must be unfarmed land. Mathematically, the figures require that 62% of the total land must be unfarmed, 38 farmed to produce the proper population density. This in every 5 square miles, you would expect to find 2 being farmed and 3 being wooded and or rugged hills or mountains. Considering each man on a medieval manor equivalent to a household, reasonable by definition of the letter, the farmland and total area of various manorial holdings or lands around a town may be computed. The following land area tables are based on the Chivalry and Sorcery tables for size of manors and towns and their internal compositions. I'm going to try to zoom in here because this is kind of what, well, I mean, the whole article caught my attention, but I was definitely looking at, let's see if I got the right zoom. I did. Okay, let's see. I got to lift this up a little bit. Hold on a minute, maybe I can. Does that work? So we see this table here where it's got the, now I actually have Chivalry and Sorcery, but I didn't want, I knew it took me a minute to remember what it looked like. And when I remember what it looked like, then I remembered that, oh yes, I actually have this book. We basically have, and I haven't really, I'm not really knowledgeable in it, but they're using their kind of definitions here. So we have interior region manors, frontier region manors, and some baronial holdings. The holdings also go on to the second page, which you can look at. So the smallest of the small, which would be an interior small manor. Now I'm guessing, I don't know, but my guess would be that the interior ones can be smaller because they're in the interior. That you probably want your biggest, baddest fortresses at points of contention, which are most likely in an established kingdom or some kind of state at this time, is going to be on your frontiers. So you're going to want your beefiest things on your frontiers, and you might have smaller ones in the middle. Of course, that might change. There are reasons why, your borders change, so then something that was on the outskirts is now on the interior, and vice versa, right? There are reasons why a lot of this stuff might change a bit, but just as maybe a general rule, I'm guessing, because you can see the interior small is smaller in number of households than the frontier small, so that leads me to believe it. But what you get with is a small manor, about 78 households, 2.5 square miles of farmland, and total land of about 7 square miles. So that to me tracks. Not exactly, I would say, but pretty closely to your sort of what I would looking at when I'm looking at kind of 3 mile my 3 mile hexes or something, right? Something of that nature. You can look at, if I go to, I'm just pulling it up on the side, which is my mind. I've turned away a minute. If I go to, let's see, height of 3, and I compute my hexagon. Yeah, so if I do so a 3 mile hex, right? So we're talking 3 miles from one face to another face. You get 7.794 in area, which is really close to the 7 square miles. And I remember reading some stuff where people had maybe done some of this work. Heck, maybe they'd even referenced this article. And I'd seen people saying, hey, a 3 mile hex is really good because it sort of squares with your smallest kind of manorial estate is going to be basically a 3 mile hex. And then I did some work that seemed to be leading me in that same direction, going, oh yeah, that seems to kind of work. And so here it's kind of confirmed again by someone who, and he doesn't list all his sources out, and I have no idea what his sources are, but you get a similar type of thing that, okay, yeah, a small manor. Now, notice in swords and wizardry, they have, you know, four different varieties or four different sizes of quote unquote small manor. I'm not sure that for myself I need that much. Maybe I could just multiply, but I'm easy to take that and just say, okay, well, the next level is going to be about, you know, just use that kind of smaller hex and maybe even go to 2 hexes or 3 hexes or kind of use that 3 number. Not, it might not be as neat as this. It doesn't really have to be, I don't think, but I saw that number as I was flipping through it at CleriCon. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a really good fit. And it's just nice because that, what I've always been wondering about is that households number. So you can look at that households if you do that, and that's a nice number to have. You could round it up or down however you like. Maybe you want to roll some dice to figure it out. You know, you could do something, I don't know, 3d6 times whatever to get there, and figure out what's really going on. But that's what intrigued me. I mean, the whole article's intriguing, but I thought, oh my gosh, that's really nice. And so what you have here is we have these things. We don't need to use all of these, right? But we get these nice numbers with a little bit of backup here where we can kind of look at the information. And the nice thing without having the work that this person's done is that, hey, Grumpy Old Slan, and Brian says, let me get out my D1 to roll on the baronial holdings. Yeah. Well, there's actually 6. So Brian, just for that cheek, you see that here's the rest of the baronial holdings. So there's actually 6 going from castle type 1 to castle type 6. And then towns with different populations so that we can look at square mileage, you know, square miles, all this stuff. And I'm going to keep reading because there's some stuff about towns here too. So most medieval towns, quote unquote towns, are really villages associated with a noble's manor. Of some 3,000 German towns examined in one study, 93% were under 1,000 in population, less than 200 households, and only 15 towns had a population greater than 10,000. Judging from examples in Britain, the normal quote unquote town, as distinguished from a manorial village, had 2,000 to 4,000 persons. And this is something that I've always been into, is kind of downgrading the size of my, someone's calling me on the phone, downgrading the size of my, just what I anticipate for cities and towns, right? You get in D&D, and not just D&D, I'm not trying to point something out to them, huge cities, you know, Waterdeep with, you know, millions of souls and all this stuff, and it's fine. It's fine, but I always be like, no, my cities are really kind of small. You know, towns small. I like to kind of shrink them down. So it's kind of nice to see that supported from we were saying that, hey, most towns were pretty darn tiny. Most towns were really just villages with a noble's manor. And I always thought with the village kind of thing is that at some point, if you have your village that's near, and it just because of its situation or whatnot, it starts to develop a bigger presence, then it can really support, then it develops that commercial identity, whereas a village is all about just supplying raw materials and foodstuffs. That's a village's purpose. A town's purpose is commercial and administration, trade, commerce, craft, that kind of thing. Maybe a military function, maybe a religious function. So once you have some village and a castle, and for whatever reason, be it location or someone just desires it or whatnot, it sort of grows organically, or that function's maybe thrust upon it, then it becomes a town, and it becomes much less about the raw materials and supplying than it about taking those things and converting it into some kind of service. Yes, Grumpy Old Slan. This is the Wargamer Magazine, Wargaming Magazine that I bought from the Fleetwood's Cabinet of Curiosities. Absolutely. Okay, so now, here we go. The greatest medieval city in Western Europe is generally thought to be Paris, whose population was double London and quoted at 80,000 persons. However, most scholars feel this figure is best for the early 1300s when medieval population peaked. France's population in 1340 is estimated at 21 million, so that working backward and proportionally, if Paris was 80,000 in 1340, it would be about 34,000 in 1200 AD. London, the next largest outside the Mediterranean basin, would be 23,000 or so. Thus, with towns averaging 2,000 to 4,000 persons, it is not unreasonable to call a city, quote unquote, something with 10,000 or more, or certainly with 15,000. Medieval cities, I'll move this up so you can see it. Medieval cities could only exist because they imported food. This is something else that I've talked about, right? I just mentioned it. Villages are for food, and cities and towns and whatnot are for basically consuming materials and turning it into something else. Medieval cities could only exist because they imported food. The major cities of northern Italy very often, only had enough farmland outside their walls for half their needs. The rest was purchased from boundary. I guess that's from boundary. The city's political boundary, either from neighboring agricultural regions or sometimes shipped by land or sea at some distance. With this as a precedent, it is likely that a single town or castle was unable to provide direct control and security for more than 60 to 70 square miles of farmland, or a total territory of 150 to 200 square miles. This means that a square area 12 by 12 or 14 by 14 miles, or a circle of 14 to 60 miles in diameter. This is about the distance an army can comfortably march in a day. It would be nice to figure out those numbers, and I could probably sit there and calculate it out to about what that is. I don't know. However, what it is suggesting is one castle for some massive piece of land isn't going to cut it. You're going to need more, and of course you could probably work out if a town can only support about half of itself with its food, then you can maybe even think about, well, how much does a village produce? Then how many villages does it take for a town of so many people? And that's something I want to do. I messed around with this before on one of my streams where I was saying, okay, if you have 4 villages clustered together, maybe one of those villages could become a town, because then it can be supported by importing materials from the surrounding villages. And I'm probably going to try to come up with some decent round numbers to use just as something to go with. I'm not there yet, but this is it seems to be sort of suggesting a similar type system, though he hadn't gotten around, at least in this article, to figuring out what that would be. This data checks, since the entire concept of feudal military structure is that the local castle, fortified town, or city, or whatever, will provide all necessary military security for its lands on a direct and immediate basis. The size of territory given above, at the maximum, permits forces from a centrally located castle or town to reach any part of the territory the same day as summons for help arrives, assuming the troops march instantly, or the next day if the troops need time to prepare. And this is important because in the, from the 800s on to, the Viking Age, pretty much, I'm not sure what the end date is for the Viking Age, you had these people striking, and it could be from anywhere, at least, obviously it was coasts but then rivers, surprising places, but yeah, folks were striking in there, and they're in like lightning and they're out again, and you don't have time to signal back to Paris in the center of the country to then gather troops and ride all the way out to you, who was on the coast of the North Sea. They're never going to get there in time. Before they got there, it's all over. So you needed to essentially give practical control to people who were on the spot, who could immediately, or as close, immediately as close as possible in sort of that sense, to get folks going. So this is, hey, we got this strong point. That strong point also means people can go flee there when something's happening. Oh, the Vikings are coming. Okay, we can run up to this castle. We can get inside. It's going to be relatively safer anyway. And from there, that strong point, the forces of the state can ride out and respond in good time. And the thing is yeah, I'm talking about Vikings, but if you think about it in a medieval fantasy type situation, what it's going to be the same thing if a dragon attacks or some other monster incursion. They're going to happen fast. One of these creatures can pop out of nowhere, and people need to respond to it. I think that's one of the reasons why the kind of medieval, the sort of European or feudal, because I know the feudal system, or close enough to it, existed outside of Europe, but that kind of feudal medieval system kind of works because it sort of makes sense, right? You might not have your fantasy Vikings, but you've got orcs and goblins and giants and dragons and all kinds of stuff just coming out of nowhere, blitzing across the countryside, and they need to be responded to quickly, because if you wait too long, the dragon's gone, they've moved on, everything's over. So that same kind of feudal network sort of works, I guess. Okay. Mapping and campaigning within a realm. Although wargamers, okay, you can see it. Although wargamers are most familiar with, this is going to be great. This is, I read this and this was like, ooh, it hit me close. But still. Although wargamers are most familiar with hex grid maps and movement systems, a little examination and experimentation with numbers can show the horrible problems involved. Not to mention the very unsatisfactory results hex grid campaign systems have often produced when miniature armies on the tabletop are used to resolve battles. Now, of course, I'm not running miniature tabletop battles, but still, it it hurt me reading that. For example, the designers of Chivalry and Sorcery use hexes 10 miles across. This gives a hex 86.6 square miles, meaning that major towns, cities, and castles will control an area of 2 or perhaps 3 hexes each, and smaller manages and villages will be crammed together at 2 or 3 more per hex. In this scale, hexes as a measuring tool become meaningless. Now, to this point, this is why I like those 3-mile hexes, because then we can really say that, okay, 1 hex is 1 manor. The smallest thing you can have is 1 manor, so you don't have to get caught in that problem of 1 hex has an entire little duchy inside, or barony, or whatever, some big multiple things in it. So that's the reason why when I moved from, it was one of the reasons why I moved from 6 miles to 3 miles. I like this idea of having this base unit that I won't really feel the need to get smaller in, at least in terms of sort of political systems. That, hey, this hex, 3 miles, 1 settlement in there, and I'm good. Whereas once you move above that, you can get that issue of representing multiple things in hex. Now, given that we're not playing a war game, it may be fine to cram a lot of things in there, but even then, the way we sort of represent hexes abstractly, I like that I can put a town or sort of a marker in there and not have to have multiple things in there. Figure that it can just be just 1 marker for that. And anything else, then what I probably will want to do with this is say, okay, if that's my smallest unit, then if I'm getting a bigger manor or a bigger town, how many of these 3-mile hex units do I need to support that particular holding? Or how big does that area have to be, that kind of territory, that the boundary need to be to support that? Okay. Well, let's see. All right, so we're on to this. And now, back over to this page. Oops, I have something here. Can't really slide out. I'm just going to see if can I maneuver this over? No? All right, it's just limitations of my desk for the moment. Hold on a minute. Let me see if I can. I really don't need these stuffs. I have something clamped to the side of my desk, which is taking up precious acreage, and I don't actually need it. So let me just give me a moment to move it, to unclamp it. You are now unclamped. There we go. Now I can kind of move this down a bit. There we go. Okay. Even at 4 or 5 miles across per hex, the problem is still significant, since there is precious little maneuver room between objects of importance. The root of the problem is that a hex represents the area around a castle, town, or manor, as well as the structure itself. That's very, like that part, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm not wargaming, so it doesn't, that kind of, those sort of hex, if there are multiple things that whose hexes touch, like that's fine. But obviously, he's coming from a wargaming perspective where that might change. However, for those who are addicted to hexes, all right, mea culpa, the formula for computing the area of a hexagon is 3.464, I guess, times parentheses d divided by a squared, where d equals diameter of the hex, distance across flats. I actually found a link to a hexagon measurement calculator. That's where I went to figure it out before. It's a lot easier than trying to do it from scratch. I'll try to remember to add the link to the show notes. An alternate solution is to drop all artificial measuring systems, such as squares, hexes, or areas, and just use a fully scaled map, measuring and marking the location of troops day by day on the map itself. This has the advantage of permitting beautiful-looking campaigns and a realistic quote-unquote feel generally unavailable as you calculate out alternative lines of march using a pair of dividers. For small-scale medieval campaigning, a scale of 4 miles an inch is very useful. Maps can be composed on approximately... All right, I might skip this stuff. So here's going into how to measure it out if you want to do this on your war game. That I will skip. See what you're saying. So really, I thought fascinating stuff here. In particular, the just I did like reading. I think it's it's kind of funny the stuff you get into doing for this hobby. Pretty dry. Granted, it's dry reading, but getting down to it with these table size or these manor sizes and their square and stuff, I think it's going to be really handy. That I'm going to definitely lean on this a little bit just to get some kind of round figures. So, for example, I might just have as types small manor, castle, town, city kind of thing, and not worry so much about all the. You can use dice to figure out some of the smaller pieces of it, how small and large it is. But really, really cool. So they mention in here, and I'm just going to slide this out here. They mention in that book about chivalry and sorcery, of which I have. Chivalry and sorcery. Now, as you're going to see in a second, my book is coming apart. I got it used. I don't know what this is. It's got some staining on it. It's got just today it was coming apart more as I was trying to open it. So already the binding is kind of coming loose, and then this has actually just happened today where it was loose in this like this. When I tried to open it, I started losing more of it. I'm gonna figure out. I don't know if I can re-glue it or how to do it. You can see here from the internals, it is extraordinarily granular. And I think we get, so here we get this over here on this side is their chart, which has, so small fortified manor house, large fortified manor house, shell keep, castle. And these are all good things. In fact, like I used shell keep in my adventure to describe the fort that the party was in. I really have never had I got this, and I think I just, maybe because it was falling apart, I just sort of put it aside. I'm definitely, now that it's been kind of referenced, I'm going to want to go through and read this. It feels like it's got a lot of good stuff. I'm hoping there's maybe some, I know there's more versions of this game. This, I think, is the first edition, or sorry, I say editions. I think this is the first edition. I'm pretty sure there are multiple editions. This one, 1977. And I think there's more. I don't know. I saw there's a second edition, which I think the second edition. So this is one thick book. The second edition, I believe, splits it up into 3 books. And I saw maybe came in a box set. Seemed like maybe taking a page out of the white box. It's kind of in a box. I don't know how big the box is, but kind of similar setup. I might try to get a hold of one of those. I couldn't find any PDFs of early editions that are available. I might have to try to keep digging around. I mean, I own the book, so at this point, I don't know if I mind finding something a little bit gray market, because I've got the book. I just want to be able to read it without destroying it. We'll see what I can find. I may try to get that second edition, because if it has the stuff I really want, which is this kind of feudal background and castles and stuff, if it has that kind of separated into a smaller book that's in good condition, then I can feel better reading it than pulling this one out. There's that. I guess we got a bit more time. So there were 2 articles by, let me see if can I zoom out? No, that's not what I want to do. Is this zooming out? Oh, that's brightness. Oh, okay, that's that. All right, here we go. There were some articles in here. 2 articles by Dave Arneson. One, well, I'll just flip through and show. One of these is not that one. It's just a battle article. Or a wargaming article. Let's see, book review. Battle of Dre. So here we go. Naval Order. Here, I'll just move it down there. Naval Order of Battle, Marlborough Era by Dave Arneson. So this is a naval battle. And it's just a bunch of, troop compositions. That's fine. I don't know, I couldn't tell you anything about that at all. So of little interest. However, the next article is where things get a little spicy. That's where we get a little spice. All right, let's get in here. So we've got, what is this? Aerostat d'Observation, Powder Burns by Ed Pauley. Breech loading infantry units in the American Civil War. Interesting stuff. Waterloo. Right across from the train station. I wonder if it's still there. Advantages and disadvantages of self-propelled guns. We do have this map and some counters for a what is this? Is this some kind of battle taking place? Middle East 48. So we're looking at Egypt, and maybe Israel. Let's see what else we have. Jack My Optimum Force Organization. I don't know what that is. Let's see. I love seeing the ads in these games. Oh yeah, here's this is great. And Whether Balrogs Have Wings, a little by Stuart Tremblay, who just wants to do a little essay out there. Just, a little single-page little essay on why Balrogs don't have wings. Not that he settled it, because clearly, the Lord of the Rings folks, the movie folks, did not read that essay before creating the Balrog for Fellowship of the Ring. Medicine in Chivalry and Sorcery, which would also be a fun thing to look at because I think they get very detailed. It might be some fun. Let me know in the comments or where not if you want me to read this one. It's by Edward E. Symbolist, who was one of the authors of Chivalry and Sorcery, but not our current target. And they got a whole bunch of stuff in here. I'm gonna have to read that. It looks like a lot of fun. But here we go. Dave Arneson on the roots. Well, the name of the article. How long is it? Okay, yeah, it's not too long. Well, not too short, but it's not too long. On the roots, called "The Roots of Dungeons and Dragons" by David L. Arneson. Now, a lot of stuff is funny. Now we don't know. I don't know when this was published. It cannot be really earlier. It can't be earlier than 1979 because 1979 was referenced in the article. So this might be in 1979. The interesting thing is the timing, right? So, it's been a while since I've read Playing at the World, and I haven't read the other book on it, so I don't know the exact dates of when the obviously the bad blood was probably already in the air between Dave and between Arneson and Gygax at this time. I don't know what the state of the lawsuit was. It's also very interesting because all these guys, these original folks, Gygax, Arneson, all the players, the folks who were around at this time, you get various versions of events depending on kind of what's in the air when you talk to them, when the timing is. So you get various things like Arneson saying that no, they didn't use chainmail, or they didn't do certain things, and earlier on, yes, Gygax has kind of. If you read some of the early stuff of Gygax, there was an article I found, or someone else posted, and I found their posting where he was talking about just how different games of D&D can and should be, and he said something like, "Hey, Dave's game is very different than my game, and my game is gonna be different than your game, and your game can be different than all of those," and kind of really embracing this idea of take this rule set, really similar. Very much in line with kind of the OSR vibe of, hey, take these things and do with it what you will kind of thing, right? Which is very counter to AD&D, which is much more structured, kind of play this game and doing its best to dissuade you from doing much, homebrewing kind of, or really making it different. And of course that didn't, had no effect on the culture that was there, but that was the messaging. Whereas you see these letters from Gary earlier on and what's in, say, the white box intro, and you get a very different message. So it's interesting to read at this time, I'm going to guess maybe 1979, 1980, of what Dave is saying, what he's going to say. And remember, this is him writing it. This isn't a D&D piece of literature. This is Wargaming book. But he's writing about the roots of Dungeons & Dragons. So let's get to it. The Roots of Dungeons & Dragons by David L. Arneson. The basic nature of Dungeons & Dragons is that of a role-playing game and a fantasy background. It could just as easily have been set to another genre, such as an outer space setting or a Wild West setting. Each genus provides its own form of escape from reality, fantasy providing the greatest amount of this escapism. Role-playing games, such as charades, have been played by society for many years, but what concerns us here is what factor the RPG played in originating D&D. In 1969, the first RPG was set up and played by the Midwest Military Simulation Association. Set in the Napoleonic era, the game centered upon the French attempt to seize the German state of Braunstein, using rules prepared by David A. Wesley, who also refereed it. This first RPG was followed quickly by another game set in the South American Republic of Ananab, also refereed by Mr. Wesley. This set the stage for a new series of Brownsteins, Ananabs, etc., which were very well received. The limitations of these one-shot scenarios quickly showed themselves. Very complicated rules suited only for pure combat and large amounts of time required to consult each player as to their activities each turn. When Mr. Wesley departed for school and an army career, several of us made an attempt to repeat these Brownsteins, as they came to be called, but the aforementioned problems were still present. A solution to the RPG problems and a whole new concept in gaming were just around the corner. Some months after Mr. Wesley left, a local TV station had on several old monster movies, which I watched while eating popcorn or reading old Conan novels. It was then that Blackmore Dungeon was first conceived. Starting with a few sheets of graph paper, the upper levels took shape. The next week was spent laying out my wargaming table to represent the castle and countryside around Blackmore. Stories were prepared, rules covering treasure, magical artifacts, setting up encounters, price lists, detailed effects for spells, tricks and traps were all devised, all drawn from my library and some old movies. Actual combat used the chainmail system. The additional monsters and player requests demanded a far more detailed combat system. Thus, hit dice, hit location, armor type and protection, and weapon classes were instituted. The one-for-one rules thus laid out have been used locally ever since, far removed from any quote-unquote variant of chainmail. Further tables and charts were then made to take into account player progress and experience. With these charts, each player increased their ability in a given area by engaging in activity in that area. For a fighter, this meant that by killing opponents, normal types or monsters, their ability to strike an opponent and avoid the latter's blows was increased. This same format was followed with all new character classes, such as clerics and thieves. The fame of the dungeon spread quickly, and soon most of my time was spent conducting adventures through the dungeon in person, by phone, and even by mail. Trips to other local groups and Lake Geneva proved the popularity of the fantasy role-playing game. Another local development has been often confused with the origins of D&D. The original game, called Dungeon, was conceived by D. Megary after the Blackmore campaign was in full swing for about a year. Not just a simplified D&D or a modified chainmail, Dungeon places the players in competition in a game setting which is always different. The individual player must constantly exercise his judgment whether to seek a quick victory at high risk of elimination or a safer but slower method. First conceived and played some 2 years before the publication of D&D, Dungeon quickly relieved the pressure on the old Dungeon Master for multiple dungeon expeditions. The game gave the old players an outlet for their energies and new players an insight into the new concept of fantasy RPG. It has been assumed by many that the game Empire of the Petal Throne was simply a spin-off from D&D that utilizes D&D charts, diagrams, etc. with little change, and that TSR Hobbies inspired the good professor to do EPT. M.A.R. Barker began creating the world of Tecumseh at the age of 10. As a work of fantasy, there are few more detailed works in the world today. Unlike these other works which began as books and were turned into games, Empire of the Petal Throne began life as a game that will be a book. Let me scroll down so you guys can see it. There we go. D&D's relationship with EPT came about shortly after the first copies of D&D reached Minnesota from Wisconsin. EPT already existed as a world with a system for adventures and conflict resolution. With the stimulus of D&D's example, Professor Barker revised his systems and procedures unique to EPT and created the first complete role-playing fantasy world to which many thousands are familiar today. Here again, the RPG nature of the game was only truly available in the professor's own campaign and using Barker's still unpublished EPT material. It was shortly after the professor's first Mimeo copies became available locally that I made TSR Hobbies aware of Tecumseh. It was these Mimeos, with only slight changes and using Professor's own maps, that became EPT. The game system used for D&D style games has proven to be equally useful for other RPG-type games. Although Fantasy RPG has certainly lent itself to providing the most open-ended type of games and have, thus far, been likely to become stereotyped, other areas lend themselves to such games. The local Brownstone games, arranged by Dwayne Jenkins in an Old West setting, came within the first few years of Blackmore. New Brownstein games, using different player abilities, random encounters, and the concept of a player playing against a set opposition run by a referee have been developed. Thus, the basic contribution of D&D lies not in its concept as a fantasy game, but in the idea of a role-playing game. Whew, okay, and then there's a note here about a future issue of Wargaming will include a new variant of Dungeon by Jeff O'Hare. Here, Jeff begins with his new expansions to the basic game. I've never played the original Dungeon or even close to that, so it'd be interesting to maybe get in there. But there are there are Dave's thoughts on the roots of D&D, which is pretty interesting. So for one thing, mentions using chainmail to start. Now maybe when he later said he didn't use it, or at least that's what folks have told me, that he said he didn't use it. It might have been that he used it for a small time, a short amount of time before wanting something more details. He says, more detail than with the kind of hit location and armor or protection and weapon classes. Obviously, he and his table really starting to add in, getting into the crunchy aspects of it. I do have, so I have First Fantasy campaign, and maybe we'll look at that at some point. But I also know that it's kind of, you can't really take First Fantasy campaign as the true, as sort of the true source book for Blackmore, because it was written in the same period around, I think, 1979 or 78, 79, and it's a lot of confusing material. I want to say Dyson Logos maybe did a write-up, or someone did a write-up. I thought it was him, maybe, of going through it. It might have been somebody else. Probably was somebody else, but it might be Dyson Logos. Went through and looking at it, you could see it just had a lot of things where you could tell were sort of hodgepodge, maybe memories, maybe just putting in new things that you can't trust that it was all kind of original. It would be kind of neat to see the XP system of, hey, do the thing more and get better at it, which we see in a lot of times in computer role-playing games. And there are variants of it. I think Free League and some of their games have used, where sometimes it's the failure, where you try something, you fail, and you put a check mark, and then you're able to test it at some point to see if you go up. I'm not sure what Arneson's version that was. Was it simply putting little check marks next to it and you'd go up? I don't know if they used for hitting. Was it something that granular, or if they used something else? I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to see it. But that was the roots of Dungeons and Dragons by David L. Arneson from somewhere between 1979 and 1980. So I picked this up at as Grumpy Old Slam pointed in that chat. I picked this up at the at Fleetwood's Cabinet of Curiosities over at CleriCon, and it's funny because it's worth flipping through these Wargames magazines. Maybe you do this already. I've gotten more interested in doing it, but I found that these wargaming magazines can have a lot of good stuff. They get pretty technical, and of course they're working on the wargame end of the spectrum, but oftentimes they're trying to solve for similar things as we are, but they're just looking at it like, what are we going to use for wargame versus what are we going to use for role-playing game? And of course, as we see here, this is a wargaming magazine with an article literally about D&D in here, so it's not like there aren't crossovers. If you have a library of these books, or if you have access to one, or if you see these in a used game collection. In fact, that night I think I ended up buying this on Saturday, and Saturday night while I was just kind of sitting around, I went on eBay and bought a small lot of 4 more wargaming magazines that looked like they might have some things in there that were interesting. So when those come in, I'll give those a look. You can really find some gems in here, and it was really funny to see somebody going through the same kind of thing I'm going through, but they went through it ages ago. So I'm happy to lean on their work. Also reminded me that I've got this Chivalry and Sorcery book sitting around, and I'll definitely want to get in there and dig it out. I don't know if I'll dig into this copy because it's really coming apart at the seams, but we'll see. So I just wanted to go over that find because I forgot to mention it on the other stream, and it was a really good one. Grumpy Old Slan says some SCA or Society for Creative Anachronism, I think, right? SCA publications may also provide some interesting material. They probably do. I used to see those guys at the Renaissance Fair, but I haven't seen them in a while. But yeah, there's lots of these kind of specialty magazines might have some fun stuff. So if you see them, before you just flip them aside because they're not what you're looking for, give it a look, because I had gone past it a couple times in the bin, and then I don't even know what it is that brought me to it. I said, well, let me just look at the table of contents, and suddenly there was gold. There was gold there, and now that gold is mine. And I think I'm going to get some real fruitful stuff out of there. So I just wanted to share. Have a great rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this, everybody. Game on, and I will talk to you later. Where's my